Imagine it's 14th of September 2022. You are a 28-year-old interior designer living in Beirut, Lebanon. Your name is Salih Hafiz, and your family's savings are sitting in a bank a few miles away. The money is not there for a luxury car or a beach holiday. It is there because your sister needs cancer treatment and the bills do not wait for politicians. For 3 years, the banking system has told depositors to come back tomorrow, then next week, then next month. Each promise feels like water poured into sand. If you have ever wondered why ordinary people can follow every rule, work for years, save carefully, and still wake up one day locked out of their own future, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, and it always leaves the same fingerprints. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. That morning, Salih walked into a Beirut branch of Blom Bank with what she later said was a toy gun. She left with more than $13,000 from her own account because the system that had taken her family's money would not release it for her sister's care. That is how far collapse can travel before most people admit it is there. It does not always begin with flames in the street or men carrying wheelbarrows of cash. Sometimes it begins with a polite bank employee, a frozen transfer, and a sentence that sounds temporary. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Economic collapse is almost never one sudden event. It is usually a long chain of promises that slowly stop matching reality. A government promises a strong currency. Banks promise instant access to deposits. Leaders promise that debt can keep growing because growth will return soon. Then one day the floor gives way and everyone discovers the concrete was only painted to look solid. That is what this video is about. The economic collapse pattern happening right now is not a prophecy. It is a historical rhythm. Again and again, in different countries and different decades, the same basic sequence appears. Debt piles up. Confidence becomes more important than cash. The people closest to the system find exits first. Then ordinary savers, workers, pensioners, and small business owners are told to wait, to sacrifice, or to accept losses they never agreed to. History shows this clearly, and once you see it, you cannot really unsee it. The simplest way to understand the mechanism is to imagine a theater that has sold far more tickets than it has seats. For a while, everything looks fine. People arrive slowly, the lights are warm, music is playing, the staff smile at the door, but the calm only lasts as long as not everyone asks for their seat at the same time. The crisis does not begin the moment the extra tickets are sold. It begins the moment too many people try to claim what was promised. That is how many collapse patterns work. Banks take short-term money, meaning deposits people believe they can access quickly and place it into longer, riskier bets. Governments borrow today on the assumption that tomorrow will be richer than today. Some countries peg or tie their currency to a stronger one to create trust. That can work for a time. It can even feel like magic. Prices calm down. Foreign money flows in. Politicians take credit. But if the economy underneath is weak, the peg becomes like a cardboard shield painted to look like steel. Now here's where it gets interesting. What finally breaks the illusion is often not one giant mistake. It is pressure from several directions at once. Higher interest rates, slower growth, falling exports, political paralysis, war, a sudden stop in foreign money. Once that happens, leaders face an ugly choice. They can admit losses early, which is painful and unpopular, or they can delay, disguise, and deny. History shows that many choose delay, and delay is where the pattern gets cruel because the longer the truth is hidden, the more ordinary people are placed directly in front of it when the dam finally cracks. There is one more reason this pattern keeps catching people off guard. In the early stage, the system often rewards trust. The family that leaves money in the bank looks sensible. The business that keeps its payroll in domestic accounts looks responsible. The worker who believes the official exchange rate feels prudent, not naive. That is why collapse can feel so cruel. It punishes habits that were normal right up until the moment the rules changed. A trap like this is not a hole in the road with warning signs around it. It is a bridge everyone has been told to use for years, right up until the day the cables snap. This brings us directly to Argentina. In the 1990s, Argentina looked to many outsiders like a country that had found a cure for chaos. Under Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, the peso was tied 1-to-1 with the US dollar in 1991. After years of terrible inflation, that felt like rescue. If you had lived through money losing value by the week, a fixed exchange rate felt like finding dry land after a storm. Shops could plan again, families could save again, imported goods looked affordable. The country seemed modern, disciplined, and open for business. But stability built on a hard promise is only as strong as the economy beneath it. And beneath the polished surface, Argentina was taking on more debt, by losing competitiveness and becoming trapped in a system that demanded constant confidence. A strong peso made imports cheaper, but it also made Argentine exports less competitive. The government kept borrowing. Growth slowed. By 1998, the economy had fallen into recession. Then the country kept trying to defend the peg anyway, like a homeowner repainting the walls while the beams inside the house were already soft with rot. By late 2001, depositors were pulling money from banks. Capital was leaving. Confidence was draining faster than officials could replace it with speeches. On 1st December 2001, the government imposed the Corralito, a bank withdrawal restriction that limited most people to the equivalent of 250 pesos or dollars a week in cash. The stated goal was to stop a run on the banks. In plain English, it meant millions of people discovered that the money they thought was available was now behind glass. Debit cards still worked in some cases, transfers were still possible in theory, but cash, the thing people trusted in a panic, had been fenced off. Look at what happened next. Long lines formed outside banks, anger spread through Buenos Aires and beyond. Karina Echegaray, a journalist in the capital, later recalled how she and her family were buying an apartment when the decree hit. Their savings were trapped. The purchase collapsed. What had been enough for a home eventually came back worth far less. That is the hidden violence of these crises. No one steals your dream in one dramatic motion. The currency just changes shape in your hands until the dream no longer fits inside it. Then came the political collapse. Rioting and looting spread. A state of emergency was declared. By 20 December, President Fernando de la Rua had resigned and left the presidential palace by helicopter. Around 40 people were killed in the unrest. Soon after, Argentina defaulted on about $141 billion of sovereign debt, at the time the largest sovereign default in history. In early 2002, under Eduardo Duhalde, the country abandoned the one-to-one currency system and devalued. For ordinary people, this was not an abstract debt event, it was a full assault on everyday life. The World Bank found that poverty rose from 37% in 2001 to 58% by the end of 2002. Many middle-class families fell into poverty for the first time. Wages fell, families reduced food spending, some sold assets, some cut school materials and doctor visits. Argentina's inflation rose above 40% by the end of 2002. BBC interviews from the time and later. Anniversaries described looted supermarkets, missed mortgage payments, and the trauma of knocking on locked bank doors while no one answered. And here's the deeper mechanism. Argentina did not collapse because people suddenly became irresponsible in December 2001. It collapsed because a fixed promise had become impossible to defend without enough dollars, enough growth, or enough trust. Once the promise could no longer be maintained, the system did what these systems often do. It trapped domestic savers first. It did not say, "We were wrong." It said, "Please wait." In economic history, those two phrases often arrive together. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank account says you have money, but the rules change the moment you need it, did you ever really own that money in the form you believed you did? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Argentina shows one version of collapse. Cyprus shows another. In Argentina, the door was locked. In Cyprus, the door opened, but part of what was inside had been quietly moved somewhere else. Cyprus entered the Euro era with banks that grew far larger than the country's own economy. For a while, that looked like success. Foreign deposits flowed in. The island became a financial hub. Money came because trust came, and trust came because people assumed Euro membership meant safety. But big banks sitting on a small economy can be like tall buildings on a narrow pier. They look impressive right up until the water turns rough. Then Greece shook the region. Cypriot banks had heavy exposure to Greek debt and Greek assets. When Greece restructured its debt and the Euro crisis spread, Cypriot banks took huge losses. By 2013, the government could not rescue the financial system on its own. In March of that year, Cyprus agreed to a rescue package worth up to 10 billion euros from European institutions and the IMF. But unlike many earlier rescue deals, this one made a brutal point very clear. Not every bailout, meaning outside rescue, is really paid for from the outside. Laiki Bank, also called Cyprus Popular Bank, was wound down. Insured deposits were moved. Uninsured deposits were left in the bad part of the bank to be liquidated over time. At Bank of Cyprus, deposits above 100,000 euros faced an immediate bail-in, which means the bank was recapitalized by forcing large depositors to absorb losses. First, 37.5% of uninsured deposits were converted into shares. Another 22.5% was frozen as a buffer. Reuters later reported that the final conversion for large uninsured depositors reached 47.5%, equal to about 8 billion euros. Pause there for a second. This mattered far beyond Cyprus because it exposed a rule most ordinary people never think about. Money in a bank account is not the same thing as cash in a safe with your name on it. Legally and practically, it is often a claim on an institution. And when that institution is in trouble, the claim can change shape. In Cyprus, part of some depositors' money did not merely become inaccessible for a while, it became bank equity. In plain words, savings turned into a forced investment in the very institution that had just failed them. Imagine running a medium-sized business on the island in 2013. Payroll sits in the bank, supplier payments sit in the bank, tax money sits in the bank. Then suddenly, the amount above the insured threshold is no longer really yours in the old sense. Part is frozen, part is converted. Capital controls are imposed. Transfers abroad become difficult. The blood in the economic body stops reaching the fingers. And when fingers go numb, the whole body struggles to work. This is where history gets uncomfortable. Many people hear the word depositor and imagine a rich speculator. Some large foreign depositors in Cyprus were indeed wealthy and lost millions. But bank crises do not stop neatly at the yachts. Working capital for firms, savings for retirement, and reserves for ordinary family businesses often sit in the same accounts. A threshold like €100,000 sounds high until you remember that companies use bank accounts to pay many wages at once. 1 month of payroll can push a normal business above that line. The lesson from Cyprus was chilling because it was so modern, so legal, and so quiet. There were no wheelbarrows full of notes, no shouting ministers announcing worthless currency. The damage arrived by spreadsheet. But the emotional effect was the same one seen in older crises. People learned that the map in their head of what was safe no longer matched the ground beneath their feet. And once that realization spreads, trust does not disappear like a light switch. It rots like fruit left in heat. Now this leads to the third part of the story, and to one of the clearest modern examples of the pattern. Lebanon did not just suffer a crisis. The World Bank said in 2021 that its economic and financial collapse was likely to rank in the top 10, possibly top 3, most severe crisis episodes in the world since the mid-19th century. That is an extraordinary statement. So it means the country was not simply having a bad year. It was falling through the floorboards of modern economic life. To understand why, we have to look below the headlines. For years, Lebanon's economic model depended on attracting dollars from abroad, especially from the diaspora, and routing them through banks in the state. Banks offered high interest rates. The central bank used financial engineering, meaning complicated money operations designed to keep dollars flowing in and confidence alive. The state borrowed heavily. For a while, this looked sustainable because fresh dollars kept arriving. But it was like a water wheel powered by buckets being carried uphill by the crowd. The wheel turned only because new people kept climbing. Then the inflows slowed, confidence cracked. In late 2019, the system hit the wall. According to Reuters, more than $100 billion became trapped in Lebanese banks as the country slid deeper into crisis. Yet formal capital controls were delayed. That mattered because without clear, fair rules, access often favored those with influence, speed, or connections. Reuters reported accusations that some money was transferred out for politicians and their allies, while ordinary depositors were blocked. That is another recurring feature of collapse patterns. The exits rarely close for everyone at the same time. The numbers from Lebanon are staggering. The World Bank said GDP fell from about $55 billion in 2018 to about $33 billion in 2020. GDP per person fell by around 40% in dollar terms. Real GDP contracted 20.3% in 2020 after shrinking 6.7% in 2019. The average exchange rate depreciated 129% in 2020. Inflation averaged 84.3% that year. By 2023, the World Bank projected inflation at 231.3%, with food price inflation hitting 350% year on year in April 2023. More than half the population was likely below the national poverty line. Now bring those numbers back down to street level. Lebanon's crisis was not just an argument over balance sheets. Reuters described the engineers' syndicate fighting for accounts worth $20 million that helped cover health care and pensions for around 100,000 people. Depositors sued banks to access retirement money, tuition money, and medical funds. A 48-year-old filmmaker told Reuters that her mother could not get even a small amount of trapped retirement savings for daily essentials. The World Bank said the burden of adjustment was highly regressive, which means it fell hardest on smaller depositors, wage earners, and smaller businesses. And this is where Salih Hafiz returns. In September 2022, after years of frozen savings, she stormed a Beirut bank branch and took back over $13,000 from her own account for her sister's cancer treatment. Reuters later described her as a 28-year-old interior designer on the run in a country she called a country of mafias. Her act shocked the world, but inside Lebanon, many people understood it immediately. When a system pushes ordinary depositors to the point where reclaiming your own money starts to look like a bank robbery, the collapse is no longer hidden. It is living in public. Lebanon shows the pattern in its rawest form. A banking system loaded with state risk, a currency under pressure, leaders delaying loss recognition, informal controls that turned private savings into a slow hostage crisis. And beneath all of it, the same mechanism we saw in Argentina and Cyprus. Claims on future stability were far larger than the real resources available to honor them. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Argentina promised that 1 peso would stand like a dollar. Cyprus suggested that Eurozone. Banking safety extended farther than it really did. Lebanon acted as if high-yield deposits, state borrowing, and a fragile inflow model could keep supporting each other forever. In every case, the promise at the surface was stronger than the structure underneath. And when the structure cracked, the system did not spread pain evenly. It channeled pain downward. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. First comes a story of stability. Then comes dependency on something fragile. Foreign money, rolling debt, low interest rates, or political confidence. Then comes denial. Officials speak the language of calm while the system quietly changes the rules. Then comes the sorting process. Those with speed, information, foreign access, or political connection move first. Those without them stay inside the building while the exits narrow. That is why collapse is not best imagined as a bomb. It is better imagined as a tide going out before dawn. The beach still looks wide, the sky is still pink, but underneath, the water that held everything in place is already gone. By the time most people feel the pull, the rocks are exposed and their feet are cut. Now, here's the uncomfortable part for the present. We do not need to predict a repeat to notice echoes. The IMF said global public debt was expected to exceed $100 trillion in 2024, about 93% of world GDP, and continue rising. The FDIC said U.S. banks ended 2024 with $482.4 billion in unrealized losses on securities, losses driven by higher, longer-term interest rates. Those facts alone do not mean a collapse is imminent. History is not a vending machine, but they do rhyme with old setups: heavy debt, interest rate shock, hidden losses on balance sheets, and public reassurance that the system is sound. This is why historical pattern recognition matters. It teaches you where to look, not at the speeches first, at the plumbing, at the maturity mismatch, which means short-term promises resting on long-term bets, at the currency mismatch, which means debts tied to something stronger than the local economy can support, at the political mismatch, which means leaders promising painless outcomes when the arithmetic already says otherwise. That is the secret key. Once you understand the mismatches, you stop being hypnotized by appearances, and this is where history gets most human. The first people hurt in collapse are rarely the people who built the machine. They are the people who trusted it. Pensioners, wage earners, small shop owners, parents with savings for school, families with one apartment, one salary, and no second passport, no offshore account, no lawyer on speed dial. When systems break, the ice does not crack evenly. It breaks first under the lightest shoes. Think about Weimar Germany in 1923. By mid-November, the mark had fallen to 4.2 trillion to the US dollar. Britannica describes pensioners starving, farmers refusing to sell food for worthless cash, and townspeople marching into the countryside to loot farms. Prices rose so fast that a cup of coffee could cost more a few minutes later. A wheelbarrow full of money became a symbol, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value faster than people can spend it, does not just destroy savings. It destroys memory. It tells an entire class of prudent people that caution was pointless. Then jump to Greece in 2015. This was not hyperinflation. It was a banking and debt crisis inside the euro system. But the emotional pattern was familiar. Reuters reported that Greek banks shut for 3 weeks after emergency funding was cut, and ATM withdrawals were capped at 60 euros a day. The BBC noted that many pensioners without bank cards were left stranded, and that average monthly pensions had fallen from about 4,350 euros in 2009 to 833 euros by 2015. Again, look closely. The people squeezed hardest were not international bond traders. They were elderly citizens, standing in lines, trying to convert a lifetime of work into groceries and medicine. Argentina's crisis created what the World Bank called the new poor, middle-class families, thrown into poverty for the first time by wage declines and frozen bank assets. Lebanon's crisis crushed workers paid in lira, while remittance recipients and those with dollars lived in a different reality. Reuters reported that more than $100 billion was trapped in Lebanese banks, while smaller savers struggled to access daily needs. The World Bank called the burden highly regressive. That word matters. Regressive means the cost falls hardest on the people least able to carry it. So who comes through relatively intact? Not always the rich in a simple sense. Often it is the fast, the flexible, and the externally connected, the family with income from abroad, the business with accounts in more than one jurisdiction, the person with debt and weakening local currency, but savings and stronger money, the insider who hears the rumor early, the politically connected borrower who gets favorable treatment. In crisis after crisis, the divide is not just wealth versus poverty, it is access versus entrapment. That is why these episodes leave such a deep scar on the middle class. The poor often know the system is hard. The wealthy often know the system is negotiable. The middle class is the group most likely to believe the rules are stable and mutual. Collapse shatters that belief. It reveals that the rule book can be rewritten mid-game and usually at the exact moment ordinary people need it most. And once that lesson lands, it changes a society for years. Argentines learned to distrust banks and keep cash outside the system. Many Greeks learned that euro membership did not protect them from ATM lines. In Lebanon, trust did not merely fall. It fractured into class lines, political lines, and currency lines. One group shopped in dollars, another survived in collapsing local money. That is the long tail of crisis. The official emergency may end, but the social contract, meaning the shared belief that the rules are fair enough to live under, stays broken long after the headlines move on. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. They did not rely on one official promise. They kept some form of flexibility, and they understood that in a crisis, legal ownership and practical access are not always the same thing. In Argentina, some people who held dollars outside the main trap, or who could move quickly, suffered less than those whose savings were stuck in the corralito. One businesswoman, Michela Restano, later recalled using dollars to pay off her mortgage during the turmoil. In Lebanon, the World Bank noted that remittances acted as a de facto social safety net, which means money from abroad functioned like an unofficial lifeline when domestic systems failed. In Cyprus, firms and families that were less concentrated in a single bank or that stayed below the uninsured threshold had more room to breathe than those with all their working capital above it. Notice what all of these examples have in common. The survivors did not possess a magic formula. They possessed room to move. They treated stability claims the way sailors treat weather reports, useful but never sacred. They understood that a bank balance is one kind of asset, cash flow is another, and social trust is a third. When one pillar cracks, the others can matter more than people expect. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. There is another common trait in the historical record. The people who survived best tended to think in systems, not slogans. They watched the mismatch between words and incentives. If leaders said deposits were safe but still imposed restrictions, that was data. If a country claimed monetary stability while printing to cover debt service, that was data. If banks offered unusually high yields in a weak economy, that was data. Survivors were not always economists. Often they were simply people who paid attention when reality started arguing with the brochure. And one more thing, they acted before the crowd reached full panic, not because they were fearless, but because they respected time. In collapse patterns, time becomes the rarest asset. Once controls arrive, once haircuts are imposed, once inflation eats wages, choices narrow quickly. The people who come through with the least damage are often those who noticed early that the bridge ahead was swaying and chose not to wait for an official sign saying it might be unsafe. This is not financial advice, and it is not a call to panic. It is a historical observation. The winners in these episodes, W to W, are usually not the loudest or the most ideological. They were the least trapped. They had optionality, which simply means the ability to choose among more than one path when the main road closes. History rarely rewards perfect certainty. It often rewards humble preparation. Why do so many people miss this while it is happening? Because the middle phase of collapse is strangely boring. There are no sirens. There are meetings, press conferences, technical terms, and promises that a package is being negotiated. The numbers worsen in the background while daily life still goes on. Children still go to school. Cafes still open. Salaries still arrive, even if they buy less. This is what makes the pattern so dangerous. It walks toward the public wearing office clothes. By the time it looks dramatic, most of the important damage has already been done. So go back now to Beirut, to Salih Hafiz, to that morning in September 2022. She was not trying to become a symbol. She was trying to reach money her family had already earned. That is what makes her story so powerful. By the time a citizen feels forced to storm a bank for her own savings, the collapse did not begin that morning. It began years earlier, inside the incentives, debts, and denials that no one wanted to confront. That is the final lesson. Economic collapse is not just falling markets or ugly headlines. It is the moment when a society discovers that its promises were larger than its reserves, its slogans larger than its balance sheet, and its fairness smaller than it believed. Argentina showed it with locked withdrawals. Cyprus showed it with forced bail-ins. Lebanon showed it with frozen deposits and public desperation. Weimar showed it with destroyed money. Greece showed it with ATM lines and pensioners in tears, different costumes, same play. If there is one pattern that matters most, it is this. Systems do not usually fail where they look weakest. They fail where people have been trained not to look. At the guarantee, that sounds too absolute. At the balance sheet that only works if trust never wobbles. At the institution that says everything is temporary while emergency measures become permanent. That is where history whispers before it starts to shout. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.